Good evening, everyone. My name is Dianne McKean and I'm the Communications Coordinator here at State Library, and I've also worked as a journalist for over 20 years, both here and overseas. I'd like to welcome you all to Banking Bad with Adele Ferguson as part of the Talking Ideas series. This month we explore ideas around power, speaking truth to power, and the freedom writing can provide. But firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land upon which we meet, as well as elders past, present and emerging. State Library acknowledges all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to the land, and as custodians of stories for millennia. We are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. Today's conversation will explore the events and scandals that brought about the Banking Royal Commission, and Adele will be speaking with journalist and critic Dennis Atkins. For many members of the Fourth Estate, investigative journalism is seen as a career holy grail. It takes them away from the 24-hour news cycle and ideally provides the time and space to uncover complex stories for the social good. It has its risks and rewards in equal measure, which I'm sure Adele will expand upon tonight. As a former journalist, one of the many joys of working at State Library is the millions of stories that are also waiting to be uncovered through our collection items, exhibitions, events and fellowship programs. As a respected cultural institution, we are custodians of the state's documentary heritage. This original source material is crucial in establishing historic and contemporary facts and amplifying voices that have been silenced in the past. Every week I talk to journalists around the country about everything from the history of Queensland supermarkets to the Black Plague in Brisbane. Some of you might not have known about that. Indigenous language revival to the Fitzgerald Inquiry, our very own landmark Royal Commission. And there are plenty of items related to the inquiry in our collection. They include a commemorative bottle of port, the corruption board game, historic images, and even a rubber puppet of Sir Joe Bjorka-Peterson. So if you're not already a member of State Library, I would recommend you do so. A world of wonder and intrigue awaits you. I would also encourage you to delve into the lighter side of politics with the Behind the Lines and Swings and Roundabouts exhibition on this level. There's so very much to discover here at State Library. Tonight's event is part of our Talking Ideas series, which aims to entertain, inspire and foster debate, addressing issues that inform our times and shape our lives. Speakers at our events hold a wide range of views and come from diverse backgrounds. Similarly, there are differing points of view amongst the audience tonight, I'm sure, and as always, we encourage you to listen respectfully. Please save your questions to the end, and I would ask that you ask a question and not just provide a comment. Adele Ferguson is a strong advocate for improving whistleblower protections and giving vulnerable people a voice. She is a multi-award-winning senior business writer and columnist for The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian Financial Review. She is a regular guest reporter on Four Corners on ABC television and the author of the best-selling unauthorised biography of Australia's richest woman, Gina Rinehart. Dennis Atkins is a journalist with almost 40 years' experience, specialising in politics. He's also appeared on Insiders, the ABC Television's political panel show. Please welcome Adele Ferguson and Dennis Atkins.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with Adele Ferguson. I've read her work for a long time, and I had the honour of judging her a couple of times in the Walkley Awards, and although these things are supposed to be secret, I can safely say I'm very happy with my conclusions.
Me too.
Adele, I'd like to start with a question about not really sort of how this began, but when you knew that you were onto a cracker of a yarn, because you were, and we've seen how it's played out. So when did that happen?
Well, it really started with a phone call from Senator John Wacker-Williams, who had left a message to say a whistleblower from Commonwealth Bank had contacted him and that I should give him a call. I was on my way to China, and before I left, I spoke to Jeff and printed out about 1,000 pages of documents, much to my husband's annoyance, because it was like a brick and it was going to really weigh down the suitcase. So I read the documents. I'm sort of on this plane for over 10 hours and just reading all these documents and highlighting it and thinking, oh my God, this is unbelievable. This is the Commonwealth Bank we're talking about. So when I got back, started talking to various people, and I knew it was a good story. I knew that there was something here, but when it started to really strike me was a couple of things. I'd given the Commonwealth Bank a few days to answer about 25 very detailed questions, and they came back with a 2-paragraph response. They hadn't answered anything, and it was just, happened in the past, basically nothing to see here. So I rang them up and I said, this is going on page 1. Are you sure you don't want to answer some questions? This isn't just a small story. And they didn't want to elaborate at all. The story came out, and I'd never experienced it in my entire career. I was just, every few minutes, my emails were just going off, and it was just people who had identified. They thought that they were the only ones. They'd been told that when they'd lost all the money and they'd come in, they said, you're the only one complaining. So they thought it was just them, and then they're realising it's not just me. And then there were also emails from other former staff and current staff who were sending compliance documents showing that there was cover-ups going on. And it just snowballed from there.
Yeah, I just realised that that you've let me in for what could be a trick question, but I'll just mention it without following it up, and that is what happened at that conference in China. You were probably preoccupied with other things.
I was just busting to get back.
So Wacker-Williams rings you and says, I've got this. He had a contact from the bank who had
the whistleblower had contacted him because
that was Jeff Morris.
So Jeff Morris had gone to a number of politicians, and he'd also contacted a number of journalists, and nobody had bitten. And then he started to read maiden speeches of politicians, and he read John Williams's maiden speech and thought maybe he could be the one. And within half an hour, John rang him back and said, I'll come to Sydney.
And that was because of John Williams's own personal story.
Yeah, that's right. John Williams had his own experience with Commonwealth Bank. When he was a farmer, 5th-generation farmer, there was a drought on in the early 80s, and he was living in Inverell. And so he went to the local bank, Commonwealth branch, to get a $200,000 loan just to help him pay the bills and, pay off his loan because he just wasn't surviving. And he came out with a $640,000 Swiss currency franc loan. And what had happened was there was deregulation of the financial sector. The banks were all trying to compete with foreign banks, and so they were coming up with all these exotic products. The managers didn't know what they were selling, and they now had targets. So everything was changing with deregulation. And John was told, take out a Swiss currency loan. You won't have to pay a 15% interest rate. They're about 6 or 7%. What can go wrong? They're so safe, and he was shown charts and everything and thought, this is terrific. 2 weeks later, the currency moved, and that loan was now $1.5 million. And he then battled the bank for better part of a decade. He lost everything, and he lost his marriage, and he ended up in a $2,000 caravan. So he really knew, he talks about he's experienced a lot of dry gullies.
And that was back in the 80s, and that was that wasn't a sort of a one-off occurrence. That was happening all around the country, and you talk about what was going on in Tasmania, and we also had during the 1980s the Westpac Letters.
Yeah, that's right.
Also exposed bad behaviour at that bank. And yet no one seemed to learn from any of that, did they?
No, that's right. And that's what was really fascinating about it. I'd gone on the drum one night, probably about 9 months ago, talking about all of this, the Royal Commission. And a former Australian Democrats senator contacted me and said, you should read Paul McLean, who was a senator, a book called Banks Are Bastards. And I read it, and he's talking about all these Swiss foreign currency loans, the Westpac letters, and he was calling for a Royal Commission back then, and he was described as a populist whinger, a bank basher, and I'm thinking, wow, this is like, what the hell? This is back in the late 80s. Here's this guy, a bit like John Williams, calling for a Royal Commission, but a confluence of factors managed to get one. When we had it.
Yeah, and Paul McLean ended up working with John Williams to get into Parliament eventually.
Yeah, so what happened was, John is in a caravan, he's going around the country selling nuts and bolts, trying to make ends meet, and then he decides he wants to become a politician. And he gets into the National Party, and in 2008, July 1, he starts as a senator. And that's right, during the global financial crisis. Storm Financial then collapses in November, December of that year, and he gets a call from Paul McLean to say, you've really got to get onto this, go to Redcliffe, meet these people, which is what he does, and then it all begins again for him. He's meeting all these people who've been done over by Commonwealth Bank and others, and it's back on.
Mm. And I mean, this morning we woke up, just to sort of do a fast forward, and then we'll come back into what's in the book. But this morning I woke up, I saw the Financial Review, and a number of other people here might have seen it as well. And there on the front page, we have again that the ABA and the banks are warning ASIC, the regulator, which is now supposed to be the new improved regulator with greater powers and so on, they wanted them to slow down loan approval times, ramp up the price of... No, they said that if you slow down loan approval times, ramp up the price of credit, slice competition by pushing borrowers... You would slice competition and push borrowers to unregulated shadow banks, restrict banks from using scalable automated processes demanded by customers as digital banking numbers soar.
Yeah.
So we're hearing the same thing over again, aren't we? That,
that's right.
Don't touch this, leave well enough alone.
Yeah, that's right. Soft touch regulation, keep the status quo. Yeah, because that article in the Fin was saying that if you do this, interest rates will go up. It'll stifle competition. In other words,
we'll send people off to the shadow banking.
Yeah, everything will collapse. Just.
So, one of the things that was of particular interest, I thought, in the book, was that the blowback that you received and the blowback that your employer received. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, there was a lot of, quite a few dirty tactics over time. A lot of whistleblowers were smeared. I was smeared. There was a lot of back channeling. With the Commonwealth Bank, when it really started to get heated was with the CommInsure scandal, which was the life insurance arm. And the story was done in conjunction with Four Corners, so it was the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And just after it came out, millions of dollars of ads were pulled. And it really cut deep because just the week before, a lot of people had been made redundant, because there's a lot of, issues going on in the media industry, and there's a lot of staff cuts that have been going on. So to do it just a week after that, millions, $6 million, it was really hard going. I felt so pressured. I felt so guilty. But we kept going, I kept writing more stories, and, the newspapers kept on backing me. But, yeah, it was really tough.
Yeah, because, we heard the name Tony Fitzgerald mentioned when we were being introduced. And, of course, one of the tactics that the Georgie-Peterson government used in Queensland to pressure the media was to withdraw state government advertising.
Yeah.
So this is a trick that we have seen before. But there was also enormous sort of pressure. I was shocked by some of the things that the banks did to people who complained. There was Noel Stevens, the Scaffolder. His life insurance policy was switched from Westpac to Commonwealth Bank. Tell us a bit about what happened to him, and in particular, how they ended up trawling through his accounts with his local Dan Murphys.
Yeah, so this was a really horrible story. This was a scaffolder who didn't own his own house, had $10,000 in his bank account, and one of the tactics of the banks is to actually, bank tellers would ring up customers and invite them to come in to meet the financial planner, and they'd get a kickback for that. They rang Noel Stevens up and he thought that, gee, that's so nice, they really care about me. So he comes in, meets the financial planner who thinks, oh, he's only got $10,000, but he does have a Westpac life insurance. So convinces him to move across to CommInsure. A few months later, he gets pancreatic cancer, and he puts in his claim. So he's terminally ill, puts in his claim, and he gets knocked back. And he gets knocked back because they say he's lied. What they've done is they've trawled through his medical records and his credit card, because he had his credit card with Combank, and say in his medical records he said he drinks a certain amount every night, and that didn't tally up with Dan Murphy's all this alcohol that was getting drunk, and so they knocked his claim back. He then goes to court because he's got 6 months to live, and he wanted to leave, I think it was something like $300,000 to his daughter, and they fight it. He ends up, he's so ill, he's dying, that the court has to come to his, rental accommodation, and he's high on morphine as they are interrogating him. A few days before he dies, he wins the case. And then as his daughter is preparing the funeral, she gets a call to say that they are appealing. And they appealed it and lost the case again. And it would have cost over $500,000 in legal fees for his $300,000 claim. And all of that, his last 6 months of his life is spent fighting the bank, going to the lawyers. Yeah, it was just awful.
Mm. I mean, what's the sense of why they were doing this? Was it just to keep the model going, just to keep the system, the wheels of the system?
Yeah, absolutely. It would have set a precedent. The other thing is most people won't fight. But, how many people, when they get knocked back, actually fight, especially if you're dying? You just say, okay, that's it. And so more often than not, people won't fight, and so they win.
Yeah, and that you discovered, when you published your first story, that as your email inbox went bananas, you discovered that there were a hell of a lot of people out there who had given up fighting.
Yeah, that's right. They've got deep pockets. They have a battalion of lawyers. How do you go up against that?
There was the other interesting thing which I think which would be good to talk about, is where the banks got their model from to run this system of pressuring people.
Yeah.
Now, we heard a lot of the stories at the Royal Commission, about cold calling, about sort of, bringing incredible pressure on customers and on people and who the banks and other financial institutions dealt with. But you trace it back to what's this Cohan Brown sales model.
Yes, that's right.
That's quite a fascinating thing. Tell us a bit about that,
yes.
Exactly what it is. It comes from America, doesn't it?
It does. It's Cohan Brown comes from America, and it's a way to, instead of just selling one product when you're a bank teller, you're getting someone to take out a credit card, you're actually selling as much as you can, and it's right across the bank. So in the private banking are recommending referrals, and they have to get a certain number of referrals to all different parts of the bank. So it's this just massive cross-selling that goes on. And you can't let a customer go. You've got to find something that they will want to buy.
Yeah, well, you detail in the book sort of from their manual, the language. They instruct people what language to use, and and they sort of war game what the conversations are going to be like selling these products. And I think you talk about it being cult-like. Is it that bad?
Yeah, it is. I've had when I did the original Commonwealth Bank stories, I had a lot of people saying you should look into this Cohan Brown.
And you talked to one of the authors.
Yeah, I did.
And he defended it. He said, look, we're not aggressive, I think was the words he used.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't use aggressive tactics.
We only, people only take products that they really want, and sometimes they don't know that they want them.
Yep. And I mean, the banks also. One of the things that you report on the banks having done was setting up, fake accounts, and they would even set up fake accounts for kids. I mean, that seems rather extraordinary.
This is the Dolomites.
Yes.
Which is kids' accounts. So bank tellers would have targets, and if they meet or surpass the targets, they get a bonus, and if they don't, they get a big whack. So it's this carrot and stick. So even to the point of the Dolomites school kid accounts, there was a whistleblower that came forward and with evidence and spreadsheets that bank tellers were actually fraudulently setting up kids' accounts, putting 1 cent in them so that they could meet their targets and get a bonus.
Yeah,
and it was thousands. They did a sample of a number of branches across the country, and there were thousands of them that were fraudulently set up, but they didn't actually do it across the whole lot. After they saw that, they didn't dig deeper.
Yeah, it is. It is quite extraordinary. So the lengths to which the financial institutions, because it wasn't just the banks, of course, went to keep the system going. But where was the regulator? Where was we talked earlier about what occurred in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And out of that came a light touch regulation.
Yeah, that's right.
And now that never got any greater than light touch, did it?
No.
But even with these things occurring and the regulator knowing about them, what happened?
Yeah, not a lot. And it sort of goes back to, you had the financial system deregulated. You had at that time the NCSC, which had a budget of about $5 million and 80 staff. So it was totally useless and underfunded. Imagine you've got the stock market crash with bonds, SCASE, all of these, and you've got this tiny little outfit. They then create a new regulator that's better resourced, and it's called the ASC, that later morphs into ASIC. And then you get APRA, which is taken out of the Reserve Bank, and that's called the Twin Pillars. But it was always light touch regulation. It was more about encourage the industry to self-regulate, they'll do the right thing. And caveat emptor, which is buyer beware, was at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, but when some of the things that what CommBank and CommInsure, their insurance arm, were doing, when they were exposed, as it emerged, ASIC knew about those before the exposure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And yet, they hadn't taken any action.
Yeah, that's what really staggered me with when Jeff Morris came to me with all this evidence of forgery, fraud, and a management cover-up. He had discovered this in October 2008. But during the course of the parliamentary inquiry, which was triggered by those stories, there were letters that were released And one of them was ASIC writing to the head of Commonwealth Financial Planning in March 2008. So this is before this is all blown up, saying this is what's wrong. You've got, we've done a sample of this many financial advisors, and most of them are red-rated, meaning they're breaching everything. They're committing forgery. They're doing all sorts of stuff. And it seems to be that you're not getting rid of them if they are star financial planners. So if they're performing well, you're basically turning a blind eye. And then in the letter it says, and we came to you in 2006 and we pointed out a lot of this stuff and you were going to fix it, but you don't appear to have. So it was a really tough letter that really outlined everything that was going on. They just didn't do anything. And so then Jeff Morris comes along after witnessing, the collateral damage of what happens when you don't fix it. And it then takes them 16 months to do anything. And when they do, they're telling, CBA, we're coming in 2 weeks. So they're, liquid papering over everything, getting rid of stuff. So it's just crazy.
Yeah. And so was that what shocked you the most? It
was. I had been writing, wrote for BRW for many years, and I would write pretty critical and damning stories about the regulator. So I was doing a lot of stuff on the liquidators, and they were missing in action on the liquidators, and a few other things. So I was feeling very uncomfortable that ASIC weren't not on the ball. But, I thought with the banking system, they would have to be.
Yeah, well, you'd think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Particularly when someone's coming and saying, here, these are the people, this is what they're doing, you've got to act quick because they're going to get rid of all the information, and they're not. They don't do anything for 16 months. He has to go there, knock on their door and say, I've been emailing you and phoning you, and you've just been saying, yep, we're still on it, and nothing had happened.
I mean, it was quite extraordinary that, the way that the inquiry, first of all, the Senate inquiry was set up. Explain to us how that was set up.
Oh, yeah, so that was actually a funny, Wacker Williams had hoped for a Senate inquiry, but, wasn't banking on it. And what happened was he'd called up, the story came out on June 1, and he was saying, so a few days later, you had the regular Senate estimates. And I think it was on the Wednesday, ASIC were called. So he was going to grill them about this story. And the deputy chair of ASIC, Peter Kell, and a few others were there. And John Williams is asking a series of questions. And the answers are really flippant and, this is a rock-solid, enforceable undertaking that we did. We are really proud. It happened in the past that, they paid the compensation. This is what we should be aspiring to with enforceable undertakings. And he was really being very long-winded because there's only a certain amount of time that each senator gets to ask questions. And Doug Cameron, who's Labor, so John Williams is National Party, is sitting in his chambers watching it, getting angrier and angrier at how this interchange is going. And so he goes, right. And he goes in and he says, I'm going to ask some questions. Don't you lead me round the mulberry bush the way you did John Williams. You answer the questions straight. And then afterwards he says to John Williams, you know what, let's get a Senate inquiry into this. These guys need to be called to account.
Yeah, and so we a Senate inquiry was set up.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pressure from that Senate inquiry to get it to the barrier to call for a Royal Commission.
Yeah.
And that's quite a story in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So what happened was, interestingly, the chairman of that Senate, Mark Bishop, who was Labor, thought, what a waste of time to have this Senate. You've got this strong regulator. Why are we having this? And Combank. And then during the course of hearing everything, he's thinking, oh my goodness me. So he was saying, we need a Royal Commission because you can't trust ASIC to do the job of finding out what's getting to the bottom of it. So a Royal Commission is recommended in July 2014, and it takes until, late 2017 for a Royal Commission to be called, and that by itself. So throughout this time, you've had scandal upon scandal happening, and each time the government is saying, we don't need a Royal Commission. Labor didn't want a Royal Commission either. It was only after the Commonshaw scandal with the life insurance with CommBank that Labor said, okay, enough's enough, we want a Royal Commission. Keep going, government saying, no, we don't, and then the same-sex marriage is really what triggered it.
Yes, we'll come to that in a sec. But on the calling, the Senate committee calling for a Royal Commission, the government fought that right up until almost the night before.
Yeah.
And it ended up in a Chinese restaurant in Canberra.
Oh, yeah, that was very funny. So what had happened was, so this was with the Future of Financial Advice legislation, which was really for financial planners. What you'd found from all of this scandals with what Jeff Morris had exposed was these conflicts. So get rid of commissions and ban this, ban that. And so Labor had introduced that when it was in government. When the coalition comes in, the first thing they want to do is wind it back. And so Sam Dastyari, Nick Xenophon and the Greens were very keen not to have this wound back. So they start to look at who can we get to cross the line to back this. So Dastyari targets Jackie Lambie. He goes to Tasmania and he's walking around Kmart, buttering her up, telling her about all of these terrible things that are going on and that there's no way she can support this wind back. Sam Dastyari targets Ricky Muir, who was the motoring enthusiast independent, and together they come to Canberra, and Nick Xenophon and Sam Dastyari applying Ricky Muir with alcohol to make sure that he doesn't change his mind. And meanwhile, Matthias Cormann, who's the finance minister at the time, is trying to phone up because he's got wind that Ricky Muir's about to turn. And so Sam is turning the phone over so he can't see, and he's putting it on silent so Ricky can't see Matthias Cormann flashing up on the phone.
He was, 71 missed calls?
Yeah, that's right. And then, Ricky staggers back to his hotel room and they're thinking, geez, tomorrow he's got to stand strong here because Matthias is going to try and get to him. Mm-hmm. So Dastyari recalls it was like Reservoir Dogs. Ricky's saying, do I have to go to the press conference? Yeah, you've got to go. So they all walk together in this long line to the press conference to announce what they're about to do in Parliament.
Mm. Yeah, and then that led to the calling for the Royal Commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned just there we had the entry of the same-sex marriage legislation. Now, I'm sure people are wondering, well, what has that got to do with a banking Royal Commission? But it ended up having a lot to do with the Banking Royal Commission.
Absolutely.
And a couple of Queensland National Party MPs were in the thick of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Explain that to us.
Okay, so you were always in the Senate. They always had the numbers. It was in the House of Reps that they needed 2 people to cross the floor, and then they could get a...
They had the numbers for a Royal Commission.
Yes, So, Commission of Inquiry.
Yeah.
So the difference was a Royal Commission is the government of the day calls it. If it's not the government of the day calling it, but you've got enough numbers in the House of Reps and the Senate, then it's a Commission of Inquiry. It's got exactly the same powers. It's just who you report to. And so you needed 2 seats in the House of Reps. George Christensen had already said, he was with Bob Katter, I'm going to cross the floor. So it needed 1 vote. And Barry O'Sullivan, who was in the Senate, after the same-sex marriage bill had gone through, he decides, that's it. I've had enough. This is outrageous what they've done. We can do the same with a banking bill. And so he starts to garner support, and John Wacker-Williams and Barry O'Sullivan go to the person that they think will cross the floor, which is Lou O'Brien. And he did. So he agreed to cross the floor so they would then have what they wanted.
Yep.
Banking Commission of Inquiry. The banks got wind of that. They knew that this was about to happen and they wanted to have control, because if that got called, you'd have 3 commissioners, you'd have 2 years of essentially a Royal Commission and a different set of terms of reference and a bigger budget.
Mm-hmm.
So they wrote to the government of the day, they wrote to Turnbull and said, please call a Royal Commission. And half an hour later, Turnbull gets up with Scott Morrison and says, reluctantly, I'm calling a Royal Commission. And they got to do the terms of reference and put in super, hoping that they would get the industry funds. And it was 1 year, $70 million, and they picked the commissioner.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was because they got Lou O'Brien to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
thanks to him. Yeah.
Yeah. And Malcolm Turnbull actually tried to head Lou O'Brien off, didn't he? With saying, this is going to cost more than the town. This is going to cost a lot of money. And what did Lou O'Brien say?
It was the Townsville Stadium that they had put up to win the last election, to get some voters. And that was $100 million. And he was saying, well, that was a waste of time. This is not going to cost that amount of money. So I think it's worthwhile. And nothing you can say. So Turnbull was saying the economy's going to fall in, the whole world will fall apart, the banks will be decimated, trust will be broken overseas. And Lou O'Brien said, I'm not interested.
Yeah. And surprisingly, none of those things happened.
No, surprisingly, yeah.
I mean, we watched the Royal Commission, with sort of a fair amount of sort of horror and a bit of sort of wry amusement. I was talking to you before that your book had reminded me of one of my favourite bits, or sort of in a light-hearted way, one of my favourite bits of the Royal Commission, which was Jack Regan's testimony. Tell us about it. Who was he and what was his testimony?
Yeah, so he was a representative of... So the institutions could pick who comes forward to give testimony. And so Jack Regan was picked to talk about fees for no service.
And he was from...
AMP.
AMP,
yep.
Yeah.
And, there was a few things. He lost count of how many times AMP had lied. And in other incidences, he's apologising. And the counsel assisting Michael Hodge says, what are you apologising for? And he couldn't he didn't know. He said, I'll have to take that on notice.
That was my favourite bit.
Yeah, unbelievable.
It is quite extraordinary. So when you saw the final report, when Kenneth Hayne handed down his report, what did you think when you first saw it?
I was pretty disappointed, to be honest. The interim report seemed to offer so much more. They looked like they were going to go down the route of breaking up the vertically integrated model, which is what has caused many of these problems. And while the banks have now said they're getting out of wealth, there's still a lot of institutions that have this vertical integration. And while you spin out a big hunk of wealth, you've still got the problem. It's like amputating a toxic arm. It doesn't get rid of that toxicity. So it didn't really get to the heart of the matter. The same with irresponsible lending. He sort of thought it was just too hard to go there. So many things that were really fundamentally causing many of these problems. He just got to the edge and decided to back off.
And also, I mean, the vertical integration has been a problem in the Australian financial sector now for, since the 80s, since these problems really first emerged. And you can trace back the way that the growing vertical integration of the financial sector has just made everything so much worse.
Yeah.
But even if you even if you were to break up the advisory arms and the banking arms, you've now got sort of vertical integration. Well, you've now got integration sort of latched on.
Yeah.
where you've got the big four accounting firms
Yeah.
are now sort of, well, they've been there for quite a while, but they're now almost integrated with the banks, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the chapters in the book is, so after the Royal Commission had ended, a whistleblower came forward to say how disappointed he was because the Royal Commission terms of reference hadn't looked at the role of auditors, and it was the dual role of being an auditor as well as a consultant. And it's a global problem. And what had happened over the years is the auditing firms have been reducing the fees, so almost loss leading. And the quality of the auditing is going down. It's been declining because what they really want is to get the hooks in so that they can do a lot of, do the consulting work, sometimes independent expert reports, which are not that independent because they're getting paid for by the institution. And, that a lot of leaked documents proved that was the case, that there's, a lot of whitewashing going on, which is really terrible. And just recently I spoke to Greg Medcraft, who was the chairman of ASIC, and he was saying that he's now at the OECD, and he was saying this is a black swan event. You could get another Enron type collapse because of what's happening with these audit firms. We did a bit of number crunching, and in the last 10 years, the 4 audit firms, which are KPMG, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, have earned $1 billion from the big 4 banks. That's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly buys a lot of good advice.
It does.
Obviously.
Yeah, you get what you pay for.
Yeah, and I mean that. I read that interview you did with Greg Medcalf, and I sort of scratched my head a bit, and I said, "Hang on, weren't you the guy who was surrounded by black swans and didn't see any?"
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
When he was at ASIC.
Yeah, he was the guy. I remember interviewing him for a Walkley finalist business lunch, and he said, Australia is a paradise for white-collar crime. So he did know how bad it was.
Mm. Yeah, it is quite amazing. There's sort of, so much of it. The other thing that struck me as quite extraordinary in the book is the way that the banks would attack people, and we've talked about that a bit, but they just outright lie.
Yeah.
Now, I've been around political journalism for pretty well all of my journalistic career, but I've got to say that the political PR people and spin doctors sort of they're amateurs compared with these corporate.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
We've also seen there was the fact that no one went to jail. That's also something that sort of comes up time and time again.
Yeah.
And there was a guy who was on the 7:30 report last week who'd been hurt by Suncorp. And he made that. I mean, are we ever going to see anybody go to jail?
I don't know. My concern is that we will see people go to jail, but they won't be at the top of the tree. They'll be sort of way down, which will not solve anything, because you've got to help people right high up have to be held to account. Kenneth Hayne made a number of recommendations to ASIC. He could have named the people, because it's all under privilege. He could have said, I'm recommending that you investigate this person and this person and this person for criminal investigation. But he chose not to. He kept it anonymous. So we don't know. We just have to guess who that might be and then hope that ASIC actually does investigate. Yeah.
And there's been sort of silence almost from the Parliament. I mean, in that same report on the 7:30 report, Jane Hume, who's a junior minister with the government, was boasting about the fact that the Parliament had sat for 19 days this year, and passed, I think she said, 4 pieces of legislation, but they're not actually major pieces of legislation. And one of the first things that the government did was ignore one of the recommendations, wasn't it? What was that?
Mortgage broking. Yeah, so there was a lot of lobbying going on.
And this was a recommendation to...
Oh, yes, to ban commissions. And what would happen is, so at the moment you have mortgage brokers, and there's been a lot of fraud, there's been a lot of irresponsible lending because they get a commission, and they tend to put you into the bank or the institution that gives the best commission. And it's based on, so the bigger the mortgage, the bigger the kickback they get, as well as trailing commissions. And I'd done a few stories on mortgage choice, which is one of the biggest ones, and it just showed that the model is really not a good model. You know, it's a franchise model, and they have to have a target of how many loans they have to sell per month. And if they don't meet that, then they don't just get punished on the upfront fee, they also get punished on the trailing commission. And Hayne made a recommendation that would have actually helped the banks. It was to the customer has to pay the upfront fee. Well, of course, they're never going to do that. What he should have done was said that you've got a panel of banks, and it's a flat fee of $2,000. So whichever one you put into, you know, if you put it into CBA or ANZ, then that institution pays the $2,000. So you're actually going into the right institution. But he didn't do that. So the mortgage brokers really got the lobbying efforts involved and said that the whole industry will be decimated, the banks will win from this, which they would have. And so the status quo was maintained, but it hasn't fixed the problem.
No, but neither side of, well, both sides of politics just ignored it. They just let it happen. They let the lobbying effort win.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make you very sort of optimistic for what else might happen coming out of Haines' report.
But it's gone on. You know, that's the other thing that I've noticed over the decades is the power of lobbying. You know, so there's been all of these. You know, I remember Alan Fells did a big review of life insurance on the back of some terrible stuff that was happening in the early 90s. And he's recommending a code of conduct, looking at commissions, all these great things. The lobbyists get involved and nothing changes. You know, every time you'll have a great report that comes out with recommendations, and then the lobby groups get into it and the vested interest, and it just gets watered down.
What did you make of Ken Haynes' speech that he gave in Melbourne last month, which was just recently published? Do you think that there was an element of him being concerned that nothing was going to happen, that nothing was going to change?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what he's saying, that, you know, there's paralysis in politics and there's too much vested interest.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how we're going to change that.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've got this idea of, you know, sort of we've been continually warned that we shouldn't take too much action. We shouldn't have heads on sticks, and we haven't seen any heads on sticks. But you know, would that really change? I mean, do you think that the only? I mean, I know that Graham Samuel has said that the only thing that's going to make these people take any notice is if people start going to jail.
Yeah, I agree, because I think that's when fear overrides greed, you can get change. There's just no fear of the regulators, and that's why a lot of this has happened. You know, so when you've got conflicted remuneration and bonuses and targets and all of that stuff, and you have weak regulators and there's no fear, you know, where they're actually sending off draft press releases so that the institution can say, oh, I don't like that wording. You know, there is no fear there, so there's no consequence, and things just get worse and worse. And, you know, they become enablers, whereas if people go to jail and it looks like the regulators are getting tough and there are consequences, then I think culture will start to change. And it starts at the top.
Mm. Yeah, well, we've seen in America that no one went to jail there for any of what were much bigger financial scandals. And Graham Samuel has indicated when he launched your book in Sydney that we'll be revisiting a lot of these things in 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's a fairly pessimistic view from someone who has been right inside the beast.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, unfortunately, I think he's right. When you're looking at the lobby groups in action now, how long it's taking the government to, enforce the 76 recommendations, when you're looking at, the front page of the Financial Review where ASIC is trying to get a little bit tough on irresponsible lending, and they're all, fire and brimstone will rain down if anything changes.
And what people who are today or today feel they're being ill-served by their banks or ill-served by their financial institutions, what should they do? What advice would you have for them?
I think a few things is they have to really, arc up to the institutions, write to them, go to AFCA, which is, a complaints body, go to the media, go to the politicians, because the only way things, you really have to keep the spotlight on wrongdoing.
And one of the other things that I thought was interesting was this idea that there has been over time. I think you talk about it in the book. A revolving door between the regulator and the banks.
Yeah.
Is that still going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a story just a couple of weeks ago about a very senior legal counsel at AMP is about to go to ASIC as the deputy legal counsel of APRA. It's still going on. That's after everything that has happened.
Yeah, and one of the sort of it's sort of funny in a macabre way was this idea of the fake Adele. Could you tell us about who was the fake Adele? Was there a fake Adele, and how did you find out?
There was definitely a fake Adele. It was not me. So this was CommonSure, which they was sort of played dirty, and one of the legal counsels at CommBank had written to the head of ABC and also to Fairfax to say, we understand from Adele Ferguson that she was given documents from Dr. Ben Coe. Well, I never said where I got my documents from. And he's saying, and we understand that some of them are personal medical files and that is a breach of privacy. So she needs to write to all of these people to tell them that she has got these files. Otherwise, I'm going to have to report her to blah, blah, and blah, blah. We thought, okay. And then a few days later, I get a phone call from the PR at Maurice Blackburn who says, do you know this woman? And I thought, I don't know. So I did search my Gmail to see if this woman who was a victim of CommonSure had gone to Maurice Blackburn to get help. But a fake Adele, someone from Adele from Four Corners had called her, had gone through, knew all about her personal details, and had said, come to Sydney and I will pay for your accommodation, your meals, and I want you to meet a different lawyer. So I'm acting as a poacher. It's just incredible. And the PR said, I didn't think it sounded like something you'd do. But it was lucky I had a relationship with this PR, and who knows how many other people this, fake Adele had gone to. Just to smear me that I look like I'm, on the take, trying to get money out of a law, pinching from one law firm to another law firm.
Yep.
And we wrote to the council at Combank to tell them there's someone who's impersonating me, who's got all of, who's doing all of this stuff. We never heard back from him.
Quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And we'll just turn it over to some questions from the audience, if we could. So there's a roving mic over here, and the first one is over there.
Good evening.
Hello.
Thank you. The first, I want to reiterate, Adele, I just think you're a legend.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you. And I confess to being a fan of Alan Fels. In fact, Alan Fels, during his time as a head regulator, I'm not sure you're aware, was identified third most popular person in the country at the time, which is unheard of.
It is
unprecedented for a public servant. I'm also interested to hear that Graham Samuels opened your book, or was present at your book opening, because if we look at the record, from the time Alan Fels left, Graham Samuels took over from him. From that time, the regulator started going bad, the same as ASIC and APRA. And I know that's a big claim, but I can qualify it. Everybody looks at APRA and ASIC. They believe that these two are the rogue regulatory agencies, and remember, ASIC and the ACCC are sister regulators, brother and sister regulators. But if we look at ACCC, we see exactly the same thing. Rod Sims, the current head of ACCC, a couple of years ago, publicly stated that he no longer believes in privatisation. Well, he's been at economics for 30 years. He finally doesn't believe in privatisation, and he's head of the ACCC. Also, we've got an energy crisis. The chief scientist brought down a review, which failed. So the ACCC was given the job of doing the review and given extraordinary investigative powers by the government to do so. It came down with a recommendation to resolve the energy crisis of a gas price that would be set at an export port, a port where our gas is exported to.
Have you got a question, sir?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. That price was found by the IEEFA to be 50% too high. So what we've got here is and that your book goes right back to the beginning of the onset of neoliberalism back into the 80s. We've got an existential crisis. Worse than that, from US analysis that I'm currently reading, we've got a global debt deflation crisis bearing down on us with force. That's on the whole world. With Australia having a corrupt financial industry, telecommunications industry, energy industry, all vertically integrated. In fact, the NBN was created because of the vertical integration. Okay, but we've got the same dynamics we've got the same dynamics all the way through. If we're going to be hit with a global debt depression, debt deflation depression, where do we go from here?
That's a big question. Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
And if you could keep your preamble a bit shorter.
Excellent book. Thank you for taking the time to write it. It's a wonderful contribution to Australia and Australian society. My question comes from a quote in the book where the Commonwealth Bank give advice to their people in their own boardroom of caveat emptor. If those of us who can be aware are aware, what happens to those of us, those Australians who can't?
Oh, well, you see, this is why it's so terrible. And I think this caveat emptor is a big problem because, these product disclosure statements and contracts are written by lawyers, so you can't be aware. And that is a huge problem. Because you have to, it's like with the life insurance policies. How are you meant to know that your troponin levels is a medical definition that's a decade out of date? But because it's in there, caveat emptor, buyer beware, you should know. How are you supposed to know?
Thank you. I've got one question with regards to the vertical integration between banks and different accounting firms and so forth. Do you sort of worry with the links between supposed independent financial advisors, their associations with merchant banks and retail banks, real estate agents, particularly across asset classes, offering advice with no declarations of interest?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
It's the lack of transparency and the conflicts that causes so many of the problems. People go there thinking that they're getting independent advice, and if there's kickbacks going on, it's all conflicted, and that's where the problems lie.
Yeah, hi Adele, thanks for your excellent book. I'm just quoting from there where you've said on the very first page that you didn't expect to ever find anyone more grubby or corrupt than liquidators. I'm just interested to know if you ever think we'll have a proper investigation into what they do and their links with the banks.
I would love one, yeah. I think, there was a parliamentary inquiry into the liquidators, and many years ago, not a lot happened. So it's still one of those industries that needs to be properly looked at. There's a real connection with the banks, it's all part of the same problem.
Is it possible that CommSec, the investment arm of the Commonwealth Bank, is it possible that that's seen to be now the only non-corrupt arm of the Commonwealth Bank?
I'm not 100% sure about that, because they did have an enforceable undertaking a few years ago for not doing the right thing. So I haven't checked up that they are doing the right thing now, but they haven't had a clean bill of health throughout their entire history.
Thank you. Hello, Adele.
Hello.
Thank you, Dennis. I can't imagine how much pressure you would have been under and how sick you felt over the years of just discovering all this wrongdoing. So I really commend you for everything that you've done to help bring the Royal Commission about. APRA, the APRA Cultural and Governance Review into the Commonwealth Bank revealed lots of wrongdoing.
Yes.
The regulator has asked 35 financial institutions to do a similar review. 2 financial institutions have made it public. We know that the ANZ Bank has said no, we won't make it public. What's your view, Adele, in terms of, making those 35 reviews public?
I think they should be. I can't believe that APRA has left it to them to make that decision. They are the regulator, and they have ways and means that they could do that. It's outrageous that they haven't. Because look what we found from CommBank. We found so much from that review. We should know what's going on in all those other institutions as well.
Adele, thank you. There is I have a feeling that in Australia we're very good at thinking that the solution is always more legislation, but we very much underfund enforcement. Could you, prosecutions, and there's calls for more prosecutions and criminal charges and so forth, are extremely costly. Could you give us your view on the funding of the institute of the APRA and so forth.
Yeah, I agree. They do need more funding. There's never enough funding, and for many years they were stripped of funding. That was one of the problems. In terms of, but a problem with the regulators was they weren't using the powers that they had. So I understand what you mean about legislation, giving them more penalties, more powers. They need to learn to use the ones that they do have. And I'll give you an example. With CommInsure, for example, they looked at 4 advertisements and there was false and misleading conduct. Commissioner Hayne said under his calculation, that's about $2 million per breach, which is $8 million. What they did was wrote a press release and had them pay a $300,000 community benefit donation.
Good evening, Adele. Of course, the extent of this misconduct was human carnage, as you showcased in your book. Do you think any of these institutions really understood the impact that it had on everyday people, everyday families?
I think at the front line they did, but higher up they didn't. And I think it was very easy for them to say it was just a few bad apples, we've compensated people. They didn't really know. It was sort of hear no evil, see no evil attitude. It was the frontline people like Jeff Morris who were seeing people coming in to the branch who'd lost everything.
Hi Adele, can I please ask what learnings from reporting on a Royal Commission would you give, I guess, to your colleagues who are working on the Aged Care Commission report?
Yeah, well, I think one of the differences with the Banking Royal Commission is it was page 1 most days, and I really don't understand what's going on with the Aged Care Royal Commission. There just hasn't been enough publicity, which really surprises me. I don't know whether it's because it's too confronting. We can't deal with it. But yeah, I find it really disturbing that there hasn't been much more publicity about it. And I really don't know what the answer is. Is it because, they've been to Adelaide for a while and there aren't many journalists in Adelaide? Yeah, I'm not sure.
They're coming here next Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, they were here last week, and they got very, very little coverage. I was shocked by the lack of coverage, because I was talking to a couple of journalists who were there, and there were good stories there.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, but
I don't understand what's going on.
I think that people find it a bit too hard.
Yeah.
Editors do, more so than the reporters, and I think that's sad. Another area that you've covered a fair bit since you started on this work is the franchise business. Can you tell us a bit about that, what you've found there?
Yeah.
And are we going to see any reform, do you think? Or what do you think should be done about the franchise industry, and do you think that it's capable of being reformed?
Yeah. Oh, well, no, it's a $170 billion sector. In Australia, we have per capita more franchises than any other country. So it's huge here. And there's just been, there's just been so much. Franchising is a great concept. It has just been, really screwed up by franchisors getting too greedy and tipping the balance and exploiting the legislation, to be honest. So what's happened is you've had, widespread wage fraud at organisations like 7-Eleven. And it's because the franchisers couldn't afford to cope in that model. So the only thing they have flexibility in is the wages. And so you've had all sorts of terrible things going on with, you can rattle them off, Pizza Hut, Domino's, 7-Eleven, Caltex. And it's just that the agreements are so draconian in many cases. You had a parliamentary inquiry that exposed a lot of this stuff, and you had a set of recommendations, but Nothing's really happened. What it did was it really put it onto a task force to come up with how we deal with it. And we just have to hope that this task force is actually doing something.
Well, it struck me that it's sort of, it was a victim of the last election in that it disappeared with the last election, and somebody really has to revive it at a parliamentary level, to get some sort of regulatory action, some sort of legislative action to give protection to both the franchisees and also to the people who work in the sector.
Yeah, because it's, with Caltex, for example, the contract, when you sign it, has just a clause in it that says if you do something that isn't to their liking, such as you get caught underpaying workers, they can take the licence off you. So you might have paid $600,000 or $700,000 for your Caltex station, and if they go in and audit and decide that you're underpaying workers, you can lose everything, and all you get back is $50,000, which is the stock. So you've lost everything. And a number of people were complaining that it was a bit of a setup because Caltex wanted to take back all the franchising, so they were just going in finding fault so that they could, and that's a really, it's really shocking that you can have the power. The regulator doesn't have that power, but the franchisor does. In 7-Eleven's case, they found rampant underpayment. They set up a compensation scheme that Alan Fells ran until he got sacked, and they were paying back the workers because they were culpable. They were partly culpable for the model.
Yes, caveat emptor.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Buyer beware. And the contracts are so non-transparent. You don't know how much is coming out in rebates. You have to buy the products from head office, and they can be, getting a fortune in. The talk with Retail Food Group was that they were earning about $40 million a year in rebates by picking the suppliers, charging the franchisees, and then they'd take, $40 million in a rebate from those contracts.
Okay, we've got one quick last question, and then we'll wrap up.
With regarding the rebates and RFG, how do you stop them doing it? Because they've just increased ours again.
Oh, you're kidding.
Nope.
And that's with the spotlight on them.
Classic is the flour prices. Classic is the flour prices. They've just increased it again. They told us it was going down, 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 and they've increased it again. Reduced a few other bits which are unimportant, but flour's the biggest thing that we buy. So they've increased that and obviously increased their revenue. Don't care about any other little rebates. And everything that they say is a lie.
Yeah.
Because they're lying to us every single day. The last promotion, everything. What do we do? What do we do? And the banks keep rolling them forward.
Yeah, they do.
They don't roll like us forward to not lose or have to be forced, or we choose to walk out. But what do? Do we get compensation, or will the banks roll us forward?
You know what? Retail Food Group is totally perplexing to me because they are never shamed. They never feel toxic. Public shame.
Toxic. Absolutely toxic. Absolutely. Yeah. What do we do?
You've just got to write to the ACCC, and they're investigating them.
We did 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and they did nothing.
No.
They found them to be in breach. And what do?
Yeah. I think you've got to write to them again and remind them, because they're investigating them now, and they just need to have the heat put on them to make sure that they...
It appears that they're underfunded as well, because we get a phone call saying, oh yes, you were badly dealt with, however many months ago. Then several months later you get another phone call, oh, we're following up, speak to a totally different person, and nobody knows what's going on. And you're back to square one.
Yeah, but you also need to get it out in the media as well.
Yeah, well, thanks.
And then one question is, you're in a deed or a franchise deed, and if you talk to anybody, you're in breach of your contract, and they can take your shop away, or your bakery away. So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what do you do?
So
I've spoken to the Small Business Council guy before, spoken to a few of the local guys, and what do?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah, it's shocking.
We attend the AGMs now.
Who's we?
Bank warriors. We've set up our own group. We're not happy with the bank, so we question the boards, we question the directors, we question the chairman.
Yep. Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much for that. That was a terrific evening, and thanks very much, Adele, and thanks to everybody for coming along.
And I'd just like to reiterate that thanks to Adele and Dennis for an illuminating and important discussion about an industry that really touches everyone's lives, doesn't it? And I would like to remind you all that Banking Bad is on sale in the foyer, and Adele will personally sign it for you. So thank you for joining us tonight. We hope to see you back at State Library. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.